Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this special lunchtime edition of one of our webinars. My name is Kimberly Kay. I'm the editorial and operations director with the Legal Insurrection Foundation. And of course, we have our president and founder, Professor William Jacobson, is with us today. And then we have another wonderful panelist today, and I'm very excited to hear everything that she has to say. As you're aware, today we're going to be discussing who is funding and how are these protests being funded, the campus protests that are blatantly anti-Semitic, blatantly anti-Israel. And so this is one of those things that many years ago in the Legal Insurrection blog, we used to do a deep dive into these types of topics. And so I'm particularly excited to be able to bring this to y'all today. So before we jump into it, just a handful of housekeeping things. This is being recorded. So video of it will be available if for some reason you would like to watch it again. I'm sure there will be tons of valuable information and you will want to watch it again. Or if you want to share it with other people, you will be able to find it on the Legal Insurrection blog, and I'll put links for all of this in the chat. And to that, we do have two ways that you can communicate with other attendees and with us, with the panelists. We have the Q&A. We ask that for any questions that you have for the panelists, that you put those in the Q&A section. I will be monitoring those for the duration of the program, and we will have time at the end to answer as many questions as we're able to. So I'll be monitoring that. And then we also have the chat section, and we encourage you to engage with other people who are also interested in this subject. We do ask that you keep it civil. It's just the mom and me that I have to say, everyone behave. We've never had an issue, and I don't anticipate having one today, but sometimes when we are dealing with very personal and contentious issues, I feel compelled to remind everyone to keep the discussion on topic and to be sure to be civil, because we all have our own ideas and thoughts and can disagree in a way that's befitting of such a program. So without further ado, and before actually we jump into this, just so you're aware of how this will go, Professor Jacobson will give an introduction, and then we'll allow Anne to share with us everything that she has been working on and all of her research and everything she knows about this particular topic. And then we will turn to some questions, and then lastly, I will move to questions from those of you who have joined us today. So we're not really utilizing the hand raising function in this webinar. So any questions you have, be sure to drop them in the Q&A. And again, we thank you for joining us. We know that your time is valuable and we appreciate you being here. I will also put a link if you are pleased with this programming, if you would like to see more, hear more, learn more. All donations are extremely helpful. They go right back into the work that we do, the research we do, being able to highlight the work of people like Anne, because we always offer these events for free and will continue to do so. So, and if you have any questions, again, put them in the Q&A. Anything that's a little bit more administrative, put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring both of those as well. So we'll just go ahead and pass this to Professor Jacobson to open up our program today.
Great. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Anne for being here. I've been a huge fan of NGO Monitor for a decade or more. Those of you who don't know about it, maybe Anne could spend a minute or two of her time telling people what they do, because it really is a fantastic research outlet. Based in Israel, needs to be better known in the US. So spread the word about NGO Monitor. They really do fantastic work. So I'm thrilled that she's able to be here. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes because she's really the expert, and NGO Monitor is really the expert on the funding mechanisms, the interrelationships, things like that. I'll just give a short history of how I think we got here to this place and time when on October 8th on campuses, students were actually cheering what happened. On October 7th, faculty were cheering it, making excuses for it. And of course, we now know about the tent cities that have gone up and seem to be coming down every place except for Cornell. It's still up at Cornell. And so I will go back to my earliest days because I witnessed the formation of what is now a fairly broad movement at Harvard Law School in the early 1980s. So I graduated in 1984. And many of the people who went on to become leaders of the anti-Israel movement were at Harvard Law School in the early 1980s. And the things I saw there are playing themselves out now. So what did I see there? Saw first and foremost the racialization of the conflict, the targeting of Israel in various lingo, but basically students of color versus white Israel. And that's how it was framed in the early 1980s at Harvard. It was a tiny movement compared to what it is now. But you also had the doctrinal foundations of it, which then became critical race theory. In fact, one of my classmates developed the phrase critical race theory, also developed the concept of intersectionality. And looking back on that time, I can see what the strategies were, whether they were deliberate knowing strategies or they were just what they felt worked, I don't know. But it's that racialization of the conflict and the portrayal of Israel as a white settler colonial state, which still drives things. Then, like most of my classmates, I went off into private law practice for over 20 years, and all of the anti-Israel activists, or many of them, went into academia. And they spent 30 years developing their organizations, their associations, their interconnectedness around these concepts of Israel being the focus of a decolonization movement that has its doctrines and its origins in a racial conflict, in a race conflict. And of course, anybody who's ever actually been to Israel knows that it's many things, but it's not white, okay? So it's really just a completely false, fabricated portrayal of Israel, but it drives people. I then witnessed, really once I started the blog in 2008, so I joined Cornell in 2007, oblivious to what had been going on in academia. I think I was like most people. Oh, a couple of crazy professors. We don't need to worry about them. Well, meanwhile, every insane concept that was developed in academia is now required in corporations and government and elsewhere using different terminology. But as it relates to Israel, it was really, I began to follow in 2007 and research in really 2008 when I started the website, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I studied it and I've lectured about it. You can see my YouTube video, The Real History of BDS. And it's simply a repackaging, a very adept repackaging of the Jewish boycotts from the 1920s in what was then the British Mandate for Palestine and the Arab League boycott, which started, most people don't know this, as an anti-Jewish boycott. The Arab League boycott started before Israel declared independence. It was a Jewish boycott. And then it was repackaged. In the late 1990s, the Arab League boycott was really faltering. Israel was no longer an agricultural society. It was now a emerging tech powerhouse, and they repackaged it. And it was repackaged, interestingly, through the NGO movement, the non-governmental organization movement. And most people don't realize this, that what we call the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was really, I say, conceived at the Tehran conference in 2001, the Tehran NGO conference. And I say it was conceived there and it was birthed at the Durban conference. These are all quote unquote non-governmental organization conferences. And that's why the work NGO Monitor does is so important, because most Americans do not realize this is not just the government of Iran. This is a whole archipelago of non-governmental organizations who have more money than you can imagine, and that's how it was birthed. And it was birthed in the same lingo that I saw develop in the early 1980s at Harvard Law School, a racial conflict. That's where the accusation of apartheid didn't originate at that conference, but that's where it became the focus of the movement. It originated much earlier, really, with the Soviet Union. And we had a prior panel about that. But NGO, at the NGO conference at Durban, which was so anti-Semitic, the US actually walked out on it, is where the modern boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was birthed. It was birthed in terms of racial conflict, and that has been what we've been witnessing for about close to 20 years. Everything you will hear them say about how it was a spontaneous Palestinian civil society movement came together in 2005 is a complete fabrication. It's a complete lie. This was actually conceived in 2001 in Tehran and at Durban, trying to portray Israel as an apartheid state. And it's been nonstop since then. We've covered it at Legal Insurrection. I've covered, it took me a while to really understand what that movement was about. And it is not about the actual boycott. They always say, because they're actually pretty smart, they're not stupid people, they're actually very devious people. They always would say the boycott is just a tactic. And it took me a while to understand that. They actually don't care if you provide Sabra hummus in the dining hall. Sabra hummus, by the way, which is manufactured in Northern Virginia, but it has a connection to Israel. They literally do not care. What they care about is having the entire campus spend 3 to 4 months debating how bad Israel is. And the cumulative effect of that over time has given rise to the movement we're seeing now. For approaching 20 years, that has been the dominant conversation on campuses. The faculty has come very much on board with that. We like to talk at Legal Insurrection about how there's no conservative faculty left, or almost none. You know what? There are hardly any pro-Israel faculty left on campuses. 2 things have happened over a generation. Conservatives stopped getting hired, and openly pro-Israel or Zionist professors stopped getting hired, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. So on the campuses now, you have a generation which has been indoctrinated to view this as a racial conflict, to view this as part of the US quest for racial justice, even though one has nothing to do with the other. I think it's extremely important that anti-Israel activists have been embedded with the Black Lives Matter movement since inception. We covered the Black Lives Matter movement at its inception, which was the hashtag after the Trayvon Martin case and the formal organization after the Ferguson riots in 2014 and the shooting of Michael Brown. And we wrote on our website about how anti-Israel activists had infiltrated the riots and were redirecting them against Israel. And that's where you saw hashtags like from Ferguson to Gaza, things like that. These are very adept, very manipulative, very relentless people. And we're seeing that play out on the campuses. It went quiet over the pandemic. It's almost like, well, the rest of us were sitting at home, figuring out how we're going to get out of the house. These activists went pretty quiet, and all of a sudden, it's everywhere. And I'll turn it over to Ann in a minute, but the fact that it seems to have come out of nowhere, but it's everywhere, is not a coincidence. It's exactly what we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. Prior to George Floyd, things had been quiet. All of a sudden, it was everywhere, but highly organized, extremely well-funded, almost like plans sitting on the shelf waiting to be implemented. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a very highly organized, well-funded, strategic movement which had plans for doing just what they're doing, and we're waiting for the spark to ignite it. And the Gaza war, October 7th, not even Israel's retaliation, October 7th emboldened them to move forward with what they had always planned. So I'm going to stop now because the person with all the real information is going to speak. So I will turn it over to Ann.
Thanks so much for that, Bill. And I'm glad you covered some of the things I was going to talk about. Now I don't have to, which is great. So I'm Ann Hertzberg. I'm the legal advisor of NGO Monitor, and we are a Jerusalem-based research organization that looks at the activities and funding of NGOs operating in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we also have accreditation at the UN. So unfortunately, we are experiencing a lot of these campaigns that Bill is talking about up close and from their inception, because what we see is a lot of this starts out at the UN and in Europe. We also monitor a very large network of European NGOs, and then that migrates a few years later to the United States. And so that's something that we've been tracking. And so I'm really happy that Bill brought up the Durban Conference, because we were founded because of the Durban Conference. Our founder, Professor Gerald Steinberg, was realized from the anti-Semitism and the role of NGOs at this conference and the beginning of this anti-Israel BDS hate movement, that no one was studying what these organizations were doing. And so we were founded in order to systematically analyze the activities and find out where this money was coming from. And so today, I want to do that in the context of these campus protests we've been seeing. And just to give you a little bit of information on my background, I went to Oberlin College and I went to Columbia Law School in the 90s. So I am very familiar with this atmosphere, although it wasn't quite as bad as it is now when I was at college and at law school. I practiced law in New York for several years in Big Law, and moved to Israel in the early 2000s and have been working at NGO Monitor since then, so almost from the beginning. And like Bill, I've been tracking this movement for over 20 years, almost 20 years. So where I want to start is I do want to get into a little bit more of the background. I think what it's important when we look at these protests, the media, a lot of the media has been trying to portray the protests as, again, organic and grassroots, like they've done with the BDS movement. And I really want to take issue with this, because the protests are not anti-war or pro-Palestinian. They are, in contrast, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protests. At these protests, there's no visible presence of people calling for Hamas to stop fighting. There is no presence for advocacy on behalf of the hostages. No one is calling out Iran for its attacks on Israel and for supporting terrorism and terror groups. Instead of hearing condemnations of Iranian proxies, we hear the embracing of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. We see overt advocacy for Islamism, and of course, the elimination of Israel. And also, a very pernicious aspect of these protests have been the demonization of Jews under the cover of just criticizing Zionists or Zionism. And these protests, like the BDS movement itself, is a very well-founded, well-funded, well-organized campaign. It represents an overlapping network of organizations and activists, and also a foreign influence, which I'll get into. One thing I do want to say, however, is that some of the media coverage that's been attempting to look at the funding and the activities of the groups involved, in some cases I've found to be somewhat overstated, outdated, or not quite getting the information correct. So that's what I'm hoping to do in this talk, to kind of lay out what we know and then also highlight what we don't know, but what we need to know, and maybe how we can go about getting that information. So I'm going to focus on some of the background. I hopefully won't be too duplicative. And then I want to talk about events post October 7th and how that's led up to these encampments we've been seeing, who the groups are that are involved, who's funding them, what we need to know, and what we can do about it. So, as Bill was saying, these encampments did not appear out of nowhere. And also what we need to do is think of this again as a very decentralized network, kind of in concentric circles, where you have very active groups in the center, but then you have outer layers of groups that have really been helping these protests take hold. And again, this has been percolating for now almost 20 years and is, of course, grounded in the BDS movement. And what the BDS movement has done, as Bill was saying, in terms of saying how we have these debates on campus, where it's not the actual outcome, let's say, of the product or company being boycotted. It's again, it's the point is to create a hostile atmosphere against Israel on campus, but also to make acceptable and to normalize the harassment and marginalization of Jewish students. And the other very disturbing aspect of this is that it is not only these groups involved organizing students, but it's also faculty involved. So these are very pernicious aspects of it. Now, some of the groups that have been very active in BDS on campus in the past 20 years are groups known as the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and also, of course, Students for Justice in Palestine. But these groups would not be able to do what they do without help from other organizations. Now, some of these groups are groups that may be very familiar to us over the years in America, such as Amnesty International or ACLU. So they give a lot of support to this movement. And all of these NGOs were also very active at the Durban conference. And the other important point that I think that needs to be mentioned about Durban, then I will follow up with what's been going on post October 7th and then recently, is that these emboldening of these campaigns and attacks on Israel and these violent anti-Semitic demonstrations are always coupled with extreme violence against Israel and Jews, and efforts to denigrate efforts for a negotiated peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So at Durban, what we saw were accompanying the UN conference, which also had an NGO component. So just quick background, in Tehran, they had done the preliminary documents that had this egregious language about Israel being apartheid. Israel has a unique brand. Israel's a war crime, is a war engaged in war crimes against humanity, and they need to set up special judicial mechanisms to go after Israel, and that we need to have a complete isolation of Israel and boycotts of Israel. This was all laid out in Tehran, but what happened when the conference started? In addition to Israel walking out of the conference and the US walking out of the conference, the EU was going to walk out of the conference and basically scuttle it. So UN officials basically at the last minute did a deal with the EU whereby the drafts from Tehran would be migrated into the NGO conference and end up in the NGO conference declaration. So that's again where we see the shift from state action to NGOs really spearheading this anti-Israel campaign. And accompanying this NGO conference were mass demonstrations on the streets of Durban, anti-Semitic and violent protests. There was signage where they had Hitler's face on posters saying things like, "What if Hitler had won? There would be no Israel." So this was the atmosphere at Durban. What was going on around the time of Durban? We had the rejection of the Camp David talks, and we also had the beginning of the suicide bombing war by Palestinians. So again, we have this extreme violence against Israel, and then coupled by this international solidarity action by NGOs to bolster this political violence that's going on, this terrorism going on against Israelis. So the BDS movement gets established, and then a group in 2005, why that date is mentioned a lot as the beginning of BDS is because a group of Palestinian political unions and terror groups basically were activated on formed a BDS coalition and then basically sent out marching orders, let's say, to activate this campaign on campuses. So we began to see the rise of groups like SJP, the Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and the Quakers getting involved with this. But a very integral part of these campaigns was to also set up a network of ostensibly Jewish organizations who were explicitly founded to drive a wedge over the issue of Israel, not only in America, but also amongst Jews, and also to challenge mainstream Jewish groups on college campuses, and also to act in efforts to combat anti-Semitism. They would serve as the token Jews so that it would provide cover for these extremist groups who are really campaigning for the elimination of Israel, these anti-Semitic organizations. And so you have groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Open Hillel. These groups were then brought into campuses to start serving this function. And they would platform anti-Israel events. We have, of course, Apartheid Week on many campuses, pseudo-academic conferences. They would bring in dissident Israelis to give talks about how terrible Israel was. We saw beginning of PFLP-linked NGOs being brought to campus, extremists like Ali Abu Nima, Omar Barghouti, Mohammed El-Kurd being brought to speak on campus. We started to see in recent years legal clinics such at Harvard and at CUNY Law partnering with PFLP NGOs to take action against Israel. And then also we saw this movement trying to take over the academic associations. So you'd have faculty voting for these BDS and divestment resolutions, as well as students doing so, as well as extreme protests and shutting down of pro-Israel events, trying to make support for Israel anathema on campus, as well as excluding Jews, except for those Jews who would embrace anti-Zionism, and also putting onerous hurdles on pro-Israel speakers to come to campus. And coupled with that, we have foreign influence funding on campuses, and groups like ISGAP have really documented all this extensive billions and billions of dollars of funding from countries like Qatar and China to campuses, contributing to this atmosphere. So this hostile atmosphere, which was growing and really had intensified in recent years, brings us to October 7th. And as we know, these protests began really immediately, the evening of October 7th, while Israelis were still being tortured and slaughtered. These protests began, not only in the streets, but also on campus. And what really made me start to think even at that time, that this was far more nefarious than perhaps just some student groups or some, solidarity professional activist class in America, was that I noticed in the protests that were taking all over the world. I saw it in protests in Poland, Norway, London, Amsterdam, New York. They all had the same signage at their protests beginning on October 8th. And this was not typical signage you normally would see at these protests. So one of them, you may remember, had an image of a Jewish star being thrown into a garbage can. And that it was an unusual image, but yet that same image was at all of the protests across the globe. And the signage was clearly printed in advance. It was sophisticated. It had to have been done in advance, because how would you get thousands and thousands of signs out to these protests in less than a day, and all with coordinated messaging? So for me, that really set off alarm bells that we're dealing with something far bigger and far more nefarious, and that it was not just these student groups. Another turning point was the attack on Israel by Iran. So just prior to the attack, and I remember seeing this Israel was attacked in the early morning of April 14th. And the day before, I began to see, and on social media, these these ads kind of calling for civil disobedience actions against infrastructure in America. And they were widespread, and they were calling it, I believe, Strikes for Gaza, to take place on April 15th. And on April 15th, sure enough, we began to see these groups blocking the highways, blocking the airports, chaining themselves on the Golden Gate Bridge. And the next day was when the encampments started. So it seemed clear to me that these protests were timed to coincide again with an event of extreme violence against Israel, this unprecedented attack on Israel by Iran, and aimed at ratcheting up the violence and hate rhetoric towards Israel and Jews, as well as to divert away from the attack perpetrated by Iran. And indeed, about a week later, there was a document circulating online that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had been calling on activists to take action on April 15th. So again, we have this outside influence that definitely merits law enforcement investigation if that's not already happening. Now, let's talk about the core groups that are involved in in these encampment protests, this disruption we've been seeing in the past few weeks. And they all share some critical features. Most of them have non-transparent leadership. Most of them have non-transparent funding. Much of them have very unclear organizational structure. So we have groups like JVP and SJP that have national branches, but it's often unclear who's the actual leadership of these groups. And SJP is much less transparent than JVP. But also on the funding and how it works with the branches, because there are branches on a lot of the campuses, hundreds of campuses. So it's unclear what is the relation with the national groups, how much is top down, how much funding is given top down to the local branches. Is there overlap of people? What about the funding? Are the branches also required to get their own funding? Do they get funding from the schools? So there's a lot we don't know in that structure. What we do know about Students for Justice in Palestine, it was created by Hatem Bazian, who started American Muslims for Palestine. And this group is also funded by a group called Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation. And there have been articles written by other groups. ISGAP is one, Foundation for Defense of Democracies is another, that explores the links between the Muslim Brotherhood and these organizations. So I would urge you to go look at those reports. When we look at National Students for Justice in Palestine, however, they are a fiscal sponsor, and I want to talk about that term in a minute, by a foundation called Westpac, which is based in Westchester County, New York. And again, like I said, the national SJP has no transparency, no names, no funding information, no information on where all these groups are, what exactly they're doing. There's another group called Within Our Lifetime, which is an offshoot of SJP. It appears to have been founded by people who ran a New York SJP branch, also fiscally sponsored by Westpac. And they've been banned on a few social media platforms. And they have 3 goals on their website. Very interesting. One of them is they seek to flood New York for Palestine. That's very important language because flood is supposed to hearken to Al-Aqsa flood, which is what Hamas called its day of terror and massacres and hostage taking in Israel. It states that it's explicitly anti-Zionist and that it wants return river to sea, no Israel. Another big group, but again, we have no information really on the players of that organization or their funding. Another group, Jewish Voice for Peace, is very active. They have a budget of about $4 million. We know some of the foundation funding they're getting. They're getting some money from Tides Foundation, some from Open Society Foundation. They're getting some money from foundations known as the Kaplan Foundation. Some of these names may be familiar. The Quitaplas Foundation, the Crane Foundation, and the Olam Foundation. And they also get a lot of money via financial charitable funds such as Schwab, Fidelity Investments, Morgan Stanley, and Vanguard. And we have published a report that goes into the Jewish Voice for Peace funding we've been able to track, but more than half of it we have not been able to. So you could take a look at that report on our website for more details. Another group is the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which importantly is the U.S. representative for the Palestinian BNC committee. So again, there are potential terror ties there that need to be investigated. They also get significant funding from the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, who I'm going to talk about in a bit. Open Society Foundation gives them significant money. Now, there's also the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine front groups are also very active in these campus protests. So there's one group called Sami Dune, which I also, as the protests were beginning on October 7th, I noticed their logo appearing on a lot of the protests taking place in America, not even on campus, but on the streets. So their logo was very prominently displayed. They are a PFLP front group. They've been banned. They're declared a terrorist organization in Israel. They've been banned from operating in Germany. Other countries are looking into them. The principals appear to be based in Canada. Some of them have been banned from traveling in Europe. And they also were involved in doing resistance training in March for some of the students. And again, the links are clear with the PFLP. We've written, again, NGO Monitor's written a lot on Sami Dune, so feel free to, again, look at our website for specific details. There's another group called Palestinian Youth Movement that also appears to be a link to the PFLP. And they also appear to be a fiscal sponsor of Westpac. Again, non-transparent, no names, no funding information. And they also appear to be being set up in Europe. So I recently noticed they appear to be active in the UK. And some of these groups appear to also trying to establish themselves in Europe. And interestingly, the PFLP on April 23rd released a notice thanking SJP and the Palestinian Youth Movement for these campus protests. So that just gives you an idea of the support there. And then, of course, there's another layer of groups that perhaps are very active in organizing the protests. It's a little bit unclear, but they certainly are supporting the protests. They're writing a lot about them. And that again would be the American Friends Service Committee, funded by Tides, and the European Union, Adela Justice Project, fiscally sponsored by Tides, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, fiscally sponsored by Tides, the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, fiscally sponsored by Westpac, the If Not Now movement that's got money from Tides. There's then a layer of legal NGOs that are providing legal support for the protests. So we have Palestine Legal, which is another fiscal sponsor of Tides, gets significant funding from the Rockefeller Brothers. The National Lawyers Guild, which has probably been known in activist circles for many decades, they are providing legal support, but also they serve as fiscal sponsor for groups, amongst them the Stop Repression of the FBI campaign, which I actually came onto my radar about 15 years ago, because at that time they were doing an investigation of potential ties between activists and the PFLP, and it turned out it was related to the case of Rasmea Odeh, who was a PFLP terrorist living in America, and she was deported several years ago because she was found to have lied on her immigration papers to get into the US. Other groups getting funding are CARE, and they're involved also in the legal aspect. And then we have the more general groups involved with promoting BDS and this atmosphere, Israel's apartheid. We have Amnesty International, money from Tides, Code Pink, significant money from Tides. We have groups called FMEP and USMEP, that are promoting hostility and trying to weaken ties between the US and Israel, getting significant money from RBF and also from Tides. So those are some of the central and layers of NGOs involved. And so now I want to turn to the funders. So I've mentioned a few of them. I want to raise a couple significant issues. So when foundations, under law, the foundations have to make public who they're giving grants to. So if you look at the Tides Foundation website or the Rockefeller Brothers or Open Society, you will see very lengthy 990 statements, schedules on those where you'll see all the NGOs are giving grants to. And Tides, for instance, is an $800 million fund or more, close to $1 billion. And you'll see hundreds of NGOs getting this money. But what's interesting is this notion of fiscal sponsorship, because that mechanism, that vehicle, that funding vehicle, does not, the foundations don't report that as a grant being given out. So while we know that Tides, because some of the NGOs say that they're fiscal sponsorshipped, they have a fiscal sponsorship by Tides, for instance, they do not appear on this list of NGOs. So it's very hard to tell how much money is coming in to Tides for these groups like Palestine Legal or Adala Justice Project. And we don't know the full list of fiscal sponsors. I've tried to find it. Maybe it's published somewhere, but I've been unable to locate it, and it's not on the 990s. So we really don't know the full extent to which Tides is acting as a fiscal sponsor, nor do we have any way to know how much money is coming into these groups. And these groups that are being fiscally sponsored do not appear to have any legal status on their own. They're not 501c3 charities, so they don't have to report. And so that just makes this funding all the more hidden. So we don't know, are they getting money from foreign governments or foreign principals? We just don't know. Are they getting money from sources besides these foundations? Again, we don't know. So this is a real black hole, a real lacuna in the charity laws that need to be examined. Another thing that ties together these organizations and the foundations that they've chosen to fund have several characteristics. So again, they're funding groups that want to weaken American support for Israel and to drive a wedge in the Jewish community over Israel. They're funding groups that promote BDS and the elimination of Israel. And the other important factor is these groups are also giving tons of money to all of the many, if not most of the organizations that are part of what is known as the Iran lobby. And the groups that were very active in pushing the JCPOA and want to realign America's interests towards Iran. So that is also a very, very big feature of some of the main foundation funding. And this, so now I'm just going to go over some of the big foundations. So Westpac, which we've heard is the fiscal sponsor for a lot of these groups, itself is not transparent because it's claiming this fiscal sponsorship. When you look at its 990 form, it doesn't list anyone who's getting the money. So we don't have the full accounting of who they're raising money for. They have a $2 million income. But again, so we don't know who that money is going for. Interestingly, Tides also gave $100,000 in 2022 to Westpac. Again, we have no idea if that was to Westpac itself or to one of these anti-Israel groups. We don't know. Tides, again, as I mentioned, is a big problem with the fiscal sponsorship. Now, a lot of times they'll say, in terms of their funding, we're kind of serving as a pass-through. We get donor advised funds and we're just passing it on to these groups and we're just facilitating it. But what's important again is to be fiscally sponsored by Tides, it requires an application process. So Tides has to, and you have to be aligned with Tides values in order to become sponsored. So Tides management is making a very conscious choice, a deliberate choice about who they are choosing to fiscally sponsor. So they can't just simply wipe this away, that they're merely just serving as a funding vehicle. It's a deliberate choice to choose these organizations and to help them raise money and operate their organizations. Again, Open Society is giving some money to the groups, but really a group I want to focus on is the Rockefeller Brothers. It has been giving substantial money to NGOs in this network. Just in the past month, March and April, they announced new grants, some of them highly troubling. So they have a peace building program where this money is being given out via. And it's interesting what they say. So they claim they support initiatives that will focus on, so these are some of the things they're focusing on: reducing geopolitical tensions between the US and Iran, shifting logic from one of conflict, terrorism, and occupation to one of constructive peace building. They claim that the widespread public demonstrations helped being sparked by some of their grantees are consistent with historical examples of constructive impact and peaceful civil disobedience. And then they say that we categorically reject any claim that our grantee organizations support materially or ideologically acts of terrorism. The RBF deplores violence against civilians under any circumstance. We conduct robust due diligence to ensure our grantees comply with all US laws and regulations. But when we look at who is getting the money, these claims do not hold up, because many of these groups are anti-Israel. They want the elimination of Israel. Many of the people have called for violence or justified the October 7th attacks, do not believe in a negotiated peace settlement. So a lot of the Palestinian groups, there's one group in particular, Al-Shabaka, that is kind of a Palestinian think tank that publishes articles by Palestinian intellectuals and academics. So in March of this year, 2024, they got $221,000. And since October 7th, they've been posting a host of egregious articles, several of which appear to justify the October 7th atrocities. And this activity was so disturbing that the Swiss government suspended funding to this organization, among many others. And so these are the types of groups that RBF is funding. They're funding BDS groups, not only in the US, but they're funding a group known as the Rights Forum, which spearheads BDS in Europe. And in addition to that, they are giving significant funding to groups that are well known as part of the Iran Lobby Network, the International Crisis Group, which we know ties with Robert Malley, the Quincy Institute, NIAC, Plowshares, Carnegie Endowment, the Iran Project, the Simpson Foundation. So there's a lot of overlap there. And I think these are things that call into question, again, what are the motivations of this funding? What is the purpose of this funding? There's a lot of questions that need to be asked. Other foundations that are getting money, for instance, are the Kaplan Foundation, as I mentioned. And again, a lot of these foundations don't have an online presence, so it's very hard to figure out, what is the motivation for these foundations? Who are they getting their money from? And just turning back to RBF for a minute, the man who is in charge of this peace building grant program at RBF worked for John Kerry for many years, first on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then as part of his policy planning staff. So was involved in the JCPOA negotiations. So again, this is really a link that needs further exploration. So just I'll end because I've been talking for a while. But where I think these open questions that we need to look at are, we need more transparency in this foundation funding, particularly as it relates to this fiscal sponsorship. And we definitely need congressional as well as federal law enforcement investigations of some of these groups to discern their relation with terrorist organizations And if they have a relationship, what is the relationship? Are they getting funding or other material support from these organizations? We need greater, perhaps a regulatory review of the fiscal sponsorship mechanism. And so I think these are kind of the unanswered questions and things that we need to do going forward to get a fuller picture of just how these groups are operating and how they've been able to take over our campuses and completely poison the atmosphere, which is not only destructive to campus, but American society as a whole. So I will end there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Anne. So just a couple questions that I have for both of you. Far more, I would say, solution oriented, because we don't like to just complain about a problem. Legal insurrection. We like to offer solutions. We like to give people the tools and hopefully to embolden them and, you know, to get out and do something about this themselves. But I think we need a little bit more discussion before we can get there. One of the areas that we focus a lot on is, of course, the First Amendment protections on free speech, particularly on campus and in universities. And this might be, we'll start with Professor Jacobson on this one. How can universities and government respond to these kinds of protests in a way that's aligned with the First Amendment protections?
First Amendment, of course, is going to be the first thing that these people scream about, even though they have no respect for it. They shout down speakers. A lot of the problems on campuses are owing to their disrespect for other people's speech rights. But that doesn't mean our government or our colleges should be the same way. I think simply enforce the rules that are on the books. You have anti-harassment laws on the books. You have at colleges rules that very clearly say you cannot build tent cities on our campus. Okay, it's really actually very simple. Whatever your reason for building your tent city, you can't do it. It's a health hazard. It's a safety hazard. It's not your property. Okay, so enforce them and enforce them firmly. And you know, the students who knowingly and willingly and consciously made a decision to disregard 3, 5, 10, 12 demands that they vacate by a certain hour or they will be punished, should be punished. That's their choice, okay? And they should be punished whether they're pro-Israel or they're anti-Israel. Of course, nobody pro-Israel is building illegal tent encampments on colleges. So I think enforce the rules that are already on the books and enforce them not just against students, but also faculty. At many of these places, faculty are urging on the students. There's a video that I saw on YouTube, not YouTube, on Twitter, which I believe is legitimate, of a faculty member at Cornell with a bullhorn at the encampment bragging about how they can't touch the faculty. So she was encouraging tenured faculty to come to the encampment. Well, that's not my understanding of tenure. Tenure gives you academic freedom. It doesn't give you the freedom to violate health and safety regulations on the campus. And they should be disciplined and they should be fired if necessary. So enforce the rules equally as to everybody.
Do you have anything to add to that, Anne?
Yeah, I think also, you know, all of these campuses have codes of conduct and community guidelines. And what we're seeing here is just double standards on how they're being enforced. Because of course, you know, if you know, if you saw similar statements made against African Americans or gay students, it would have been shut down within hours. But yet, this invective and poisonous environment against Jews, and especially in these horrible statements about Israel, are allowed to continue unabated for, you know, weeks on end. And I think, to me, that's also very, you know, it's indefensible. The policies are there, so it's an enforcement problem.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that. It really is lacking in credibility when many of these universities, particularly private universities, invoke the First Amendment, because
Yes.
these are universities that have completely disrespected free expression on campuses. They have student codes, they have anonymous bias reporting systems, they have microaggression monitoring. They never respected the First Amendment until October 7th. All of a sudden, on October 7th, Cornell and other universities discovered the First Amendment. And so I that's a really empty rhetoric. Yes, we should facilitate a culture of free expression, but there is none on campuses on a whole host of issues. And so, I think it's a lot of empty rhetoric that all of a sudden the people marching through buildings with bullhorns chanting for an intifada, oh, we can't say anything about that. But God forbid you should do a microaggression or use a wrong pronoun. They will come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Absolutely. And also, the breach of contract here where people are paying to learn and they are being prevented from learning. They're prevented from attending their classes. The Columbia shut down the classes. The buildings are being occupied. The people are being disrupted in libraries. So the school is also violating the terms of their contracts with the students and the parents that are paying for this education.
And graduation's being canceled too.
Right.
That's a whole other issue too. If I were a parent who had paid $1 gazillion for all of this, I guarantee you I'd be in the president's office over this. It's ridiculous. But that's just me. So I want to talk a little bit about the legal solution to these problems. So let's start with Professor Jacobson about first of all, are there any legal solutions to this particular issue? And if so, what would that include?
I don't think there are any legal solutions to the problem. We have a very deep cultural problem here. We have that's the problem. Legal remedies can help specific problems. Okay, legal can try to force schools to live up to their legal obligations under federal civil rights law. So I'm not saying I'm against legal actions. And in fact, we filed one against Northwestern for their Palestinian-only scholarships that they negotiated with the hostage takers on campus to get them to leave their encampment. And that's a violation of this federal civil rights law, as we assert, because it's national origin and shared ancestry discrimination. So I'm not saying there's no place for legal action. I think there is, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. At its core, this is a 20-year in the making cultural problem that started on the campuses and now has migrated off the campuses, and we need to deal with that cultural problem. The legal solutions are really Band-Aids. Band-Aids are good. You need them, but they're not a solution.
True story. And what do you think about filing complaints against the schools for these protests?
I actually think it's helpful because I think in two ways. I think it can hold, especially against administration. So it can hold them accountable for their failure, the gross negligence we've been seeing to uphold policies and how they've allowed discrimination to occur against students. So I think that's, and they failed to uphold their contractual obligations. I think that's very important, not only to hold them accountable, but also because of what you can find out in discovery in these lawsuits. So, when you go through litigation, and especially in the United States, you have very extensive discovery ability to get access to documents, ask the administrators questions, which will be very helpful in finding out information as to how this environment came about. So I think it does serve a purpose from that perspective. And then of course they're useful against the organizations for similar reasons. But I think and you need to have both. You need to have the civil actions. You could have class actions, let's say by parents, and then I think you also need the investigations by officials, law enforcement, or Congress, for similar reasons in order to get the information for things we don't know, but also to hold these people accountable for what's been going on.
It's a great point. So there is the burning question on everyone's minds, it seems to be, is where are these tents coming from? Right? So it's the same tents and the same things popping up in every single campus. And so there's many people asking if you have any insight as to where those might be coming from and who might be footing the bill for those.
Well, I think that's really that's really a primary problem with what we're seeing here, because we don't know. Because again, somebody could have just bought the tents and distributed them, or it could have been money funneled to one of these NGOs involved who then bought the tents. So again, that's why investigations and lawsuits are helpful, because that allows you to discover this information that you can't otherwise find out. But and then it also reveals these loopholes and lacunae in the charity regulations, in terms of their need to disclose this type of funding.
Are there currently, I mean, there's a lot of questions that kind of fall under this umbrella of charitable giving, right? And how are people able to donate in a way that is anonymous? Being a nonprofit ourselves, we're familiar with this. There's plenty of people who believe in what we're doing, but they do not want their name associated with it because of what they do in the real world. So it provides them protection in being able to donate to a cause like ours and many other groups without being canceled should anyone find out. So having said that, is there any federal authority who could possibly, I guess, sanction anyone who's giving to these types of organizations, like the
Yeah.
Tides Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, I think there really needs to be kind of a evaluation of the reporting obligations for foundations and 501(c)(3) nonprofits, because there is this gap we're seeing in countries like Israel. Israel, for instance, has a foreign donor transparency law. So any NGOs receiving foreign funding has to report it on a quarterly basis to the registrar of nonprofits. Now, I don't know if that model would work in the United States. The United States does have the FARA Act, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So under that act, if you're if you're acting on behalf of a foreign principal, you're supposed to disclose it. But the enforcement of that act is pretty poor. So it would be hard to police. It's hard to police. But I do think this problem, it certainly needs some study. I don't know if I'd want to go so far as to saying we should have some kind of registry where people have to disclose, or we should get rid of anonymous donations. I'm not sure. That is something that we have to think about, because I'm not sure like what unintended consequences that could have. But I do think we need to start looking into this problem more seriously.
Well, donor privacy is a big issue, particularly on the conservative side of the ledger, because people will be harassed. They will be
Yeah.
targeted. Businesses will see secondary boycotts.
Yeah.
There was one of them. There've been so many of them, but there was a big high-tech company where it turned out the founder, I think it was one of the internet browsers, the founder ended up having donated, I can't remember if it was to Republicans or to Trump or something conservative. And there was a boycott by employees in the office, protesting. So we're very sensitive to this. And this is a very good example of how the good things we have in our society get corrupted by and taken advantage of by these people. What you're seeing and what Ann's been talking about in some of the foundation names she's been throwing out, these are essentially institutional capture. Okay, that these, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is, we wrote about them years ago. They're horrible. These are old line American large foundations that have been completely captured by the left, by the far left, by the anti-Israel left, and now we're funding the anti-Israel movement. And so everybody knows about Soros and the Open Society Foundation, and Soros is, I think, the major donor to the Tides Foundation or his other entities. We have donor privacy for a reason. Unfortunately, it works both ways. And that's the problem. They've completely corrupted the system. Something that was meant to protect people and promote kind of civil society is now being weaponized against civil society.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So faculty, switch gears a little bit. Faculty, how are they to be dealt with, particularly the ones who are so vocally pro-Hamas, anti-Israel? They're actively involved in writing nasty letters. And, I'm sure we have at least a few people in attendance today who have kids who have to deal with this. Is there anything that can be done about the faculty?
Well, this is another way in which something good has been completely corrupted. Okay, that something good is academic freedom. Okay, but it's been completely corrupted because you have people who for 30 years, 20 plus years, have used their power over hiring committees to create a monoculture on campuses. So they also explicitly, I'm not like sharing secrets, they explicitly say that activism is part of their teaching mission. So you have campuses now where there is no diversity of viewpoint. When it comes to Israel, at least among the people who are active on the issue, most probably just keep their mouths shut. But among the people who speak out on the issue, it's almost uniformly anti-Israel in the most vile terms. They use their power over students to convey their political messaging. At Cornell, I've seen multiple reports that have not really made their way into the public discourse of professors canceling classes, having their classes taught near the encampment on campus. And because of and here's a nice campus word, the disparities in power, okay, between professors and students, because one has grading power, the other doesn't. They enforce their will on campuses. So this is a problem that we need to face, which is that a good thing, academic freedom, autonomy of professors, has been completely corrupted by anti-Israel professors. So what do you do about it? I'm not sure what the answer is in the short run. In the long run, university presidents have to have the guts to take on the hiring process that goes on. It's not enough to say, oh, well, we have a strong tradition of shared governance. Well, shared governance has meant that the anti-Israel professors make sure nobody who's got anything Zionist on their resume gets hired in the humanities and the social sciences. Something's got to change.
Also, something I've noticed with several professors is they've begun to teach classes on the Arab-Israeli conflict, even though they have no background in it. And their only entry point into the conflict is being a BDS activist. And so again, they're like infecting the students because they're coming at it from a purely anti-Israel activist standpoint rather than, teaching the subject because they have deep knowledge of it, and they're trying to provide an objective course on the history or the politics or whatever the specific subject is. So that's another phenomenon we've been seeing. But again, it's very hard because of academic freedom and leniencies by the administrations on what professors are teaching.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Jewish studies departments and Israel studies departments have been substantially corrupted as well by the anti-Israel movement. A lot of people, a lot of donors think, well, I'm going to donate money to the Jewish studies department because that'll help, foster pro-Israel sentiment on campus. No, you're wrong. The people who are in the Jewish studies departments are either openly anti-Zionist JVP types, or at best milquetoast. Okay, so this is a major problem on campuses that university administrations refuse to take on.
Absolutely. And same thing in the law schools. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think there's been quite a few questions too about whether or not the administrators, they have to be aware that these protests are astroturf. They're clearly not, an organic coming together of students who have a very strong opinion about this issue, that they are being organized and funded and put together by outside entities. And why are they not doing anything? Why are they not caring? Why are they willing to tolerate this broad scale disruption on their campuses?
I found what was really interesting to me was when they released New York police released the statistics about the breakdown between outside protesters versus students. And it was something like, I think a half were outside agitators. And it's kind of interesting because that totally negates a lot of the arguments the universities were saying. Because if they're not students, then there's no reason at all, there's no justification at all to tolerate this type of activity. So they were kind of wanting to have it, oh, but these are our students, we have to respect their rights. But yet, if so many of the people are outside people, then there you have no basis for this. So I found that to be quite interesting. And also, like Columbia specifically, they had banned JVP and SJP first semester. I don't know officially if they had been reinstated on campus, but they certainly were involved in the encampments. And also within our lifetime, I believe some outside people from within our lifetime were on the campus. And so again, what was going on there? They were supposedly banned from campus. So why were they allowed to help set up these encampments? There's just a lot of contradictions coming from the administrations.
So I think with that, why don't we turn to closing thoughts? And Anne, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think right now the best thing people can do is push again Congress and law enforcement to do some investigations of these protests, because in addition to the harassing environment, we also have the specter of the outside influence and the terrorist links. So it is a national security issue, in addition to just, this general hostile atmosphere, spreading of anti-Semitism, the degrading of our culture on campuses. It goes, even beyond that. And also it's setting up the stage for potential real, like extensive violence in the United States, like extensive terror attacks and other extreme violence. So, I think that people should be writing to their officials and demanding investigations. That's kind of the thing I would take away from it. And also like writing letters to Tides Foundation, for instance. Who are you fiscally sponsoring? you should be disclosing information about that, or getting journalists to ask questions about this, I think is important. So these are sort of, in closing thoughts, what I think people could do to try to make some change here.
Because the universities maintain the authority and the ability to enforce things if they want to. And just anecdotally, years ago, lifetimes ago even, I worked with James O'Keefe, and we did a lot of poking around on college campuses. One of them was Columbia. We literally walked into the journalism building, or a video of it somewhere. We asked one question about where to find one person. The university police were called, and we were banned from campus from that point forward, and told that if we showed up again, we would be charged with criminal trespass.
Wow.
That's all we did. Then you have people who are not at all, this is the journalism department, and so the fact that these people are on campus doing what they're doing is just, there are mechanisms by which this could be dealt with and controlled. It's being allowed, it's purposely
Yeah.
being.
And also, a lot of the state schools also, you have freedom of information laws that are applicable. So I definitely would encourage also people to write to submit freedom of information requests to find out, who are the how is SJP on your campus getting funded? Those types of questions. What are your policies, regarding anti-Semitism? Or this type of activity. So these things can also be helpful.
For sure. Professor Jacobson?
I think if you've come away from nothing else here, is that there really is a vast anti-Israel movement that is more wide-ranging than you probably can imagine. It's not just governments at the UN, that's bad enough. It's a whole ecosystem, from faculty to student groups who have affiliations with groups like SJP, to foundations that nobody would have thought would be promoting this, like Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, to legal entities. We didn't get a chance really to talk about how corrupt Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have become. It is so vast, it's really almost hard to imagine. And I think that can lead people to feel helpless and feel unable to do anything. And what I would say is do whatever you can. If millions of people do something, it adds up. And I'll just give one little anecdote. The other night, I sat in on a session for the New Haven, I think it's Board of Alders or Council of Alders, ALDERS, which had an anti-Israel resolution before it. And there was a huge turnout from people who were pro-Israel, opposed to the resolution. I spent 5 hours listening, waiting for them to call on me, and they never did. But that would have seemed hopeless, okay? And they rejected it. They tabled it. Not at that evening. They had so many people. They actually then had a live session. So they defeated it. I think people can defeat these things. I also do believe that we need to be as strategic as the other side is. We need to point out that they're burning American flags at these tent encampments. They're desecrating U.S. war memorials. They tell you straight out that the United States is their ultimate target. They're not shy about it. And I think we need to get that message across, because at the end of the day, the audience we care about are not, no offense to our guest, Oberlin College students, or frankly, Cornell students who were at the encampment. They are not persuadable, okay? Our audience are the hundreds of millions of Americans who are persuadable. And we need to keep hammering the fact that this is an anti-American movement. They tell us it's an anti-American movement. They're anti-capitalist. There's a reason they love the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine so much, because it's a Marxist group, okay? And that's why it plays so well on the campuses, because it's a Marxist terror group who happens to be Arab, unlike most of them who are Islamist. A little harder sell on the campuses to sell the Islamist movement than the PFLP. So do whatever you can, show up. Write letters, call, mobilize people. Whatever you can do helps, because at its core, the American people are on our side. They really are, as a whole. That's not to say that there isn't a malicious element out there, but we are swimming in a fairly sympathetic population, even if the universities and the media are against us. Most of the politicians are with us, okay? Most of the voters are with us. Only a third of the people in the country even go to college, and most of the people who go to college are with us, okay? We're talking about how 10% of the population has completely hijacked the national discussion. And we need to keep that in mind. So do whatever you can. Everything helps.
Yes, and which leads me to my always and forever evergreen closing statements, which are that you are not alone in this. The media has, its own bent. We all know that. It's definitely not a secret anymore to suggest that the media is biased, that they portray certain people a certain way, certain thoughts a certain way. You are not alone, not even a little bit. Which is why it's so important to do something, because there's no one coming to save us from this situation. You have to do whatever you can in your own sphere of influence, in your own community, in your own school, wherever your kids are attending. If you have children or grandchildren, if you have those, you have to do something, because you would be so surprised that one person standing up, even in a small way, how much that emboldens other people who are going, well, I thought I was the only one that thought this way. And I think that's one of the brilliant things that this whole swarm of pernicious ideology has been very successful in convincing most of the public that we are alone, and that no one, that we are alone and that there's no one else who believes and thinks the way we believe and think. And that's just not true. So you don't have to go and save America. You don't have to go and save Israel all on your own, but you can start where you are, with the people that you know and in the spheres where you have influence. Anything and everything that you can do to speak out and stand up will make a difference. Even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment, even if it's scary, you have to speak up. We're no longer in a situation where sitting around waiting for someone else to do it for you is going to work. So on that happy note, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. You will be able to find the recording of this on legalinsurrection.com. And of course, if you did like our programming, we ask that you consider making a donation, because every single dollar that you send to us gets put right back into the work we do. It allows us to continue this kind of programming and to support the research that we do in this space as well. So again, we thank you so much. And Anne, we thank you for your time and for joining us to share your expertise. And we appreciate all the work you're doing and wish you well as you continue to do so.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.